The final steps of U.S. power consolidation over Hawaii will take place in the 1890s. And of course, we know how crucial this decade is in this narrative we've been discussing of U.S. imperialism. So it doesn't surprise us again that it's going to happen during this moment. Now, after the Bayonet Constitution, let's remember that the king, King Kalakaua, well, his authority greatly diminished. And he actually died in 1891. And his sister, Queen Liliuokalani, and this is a picture of her here, what she tried to do is, upon becoming the ruler, is to restore the monarchical authority and also to expand Native political participation. Because let's recall, they were disenfranchised. And she sought to do this through the passage of a new constitution. Now, once word got around that this was her maneuvering here, well, in early 1893, a group calling themselves the Committee of Safety, and the Committee of Safety is comprised of U.S. businessmen, okay, and some Europeans as well. They formed, and the effort there was to depose the Queen. And by the way, they had support from some U.S. government officials and also the U.S. military. All right, so in this effort to depose the Queen, the Committee of Safety actually sought the help of U.S. Marines, and indeed they responded. They disembarked from the USS Boston, landed in Honolulu, and hence you have the presence of American troops. Okay, by the way, this whole event was framed as neutral, that is to say, the presence of American troops. But despite that claim, it definitely tilted the balance of power towards the Americans in the islands. Okay, now the Queen, as you could expect, vigorously protested what was happening here. It's straight up a power grab, right? It's a overthrow of a government. And despite this, she knew that there's going to be a loss of life, even the possibility of widespread bloodshed. So what she did is she trusted that the United States, by the way, would investigate it. And once they determined that this was unlawful, well, she trusted that the U.S. would restore her lawful authority. Now, interestingly enough, the president at that time, Grover Cleveland, he initially condemned the overthrow. So he was in support of Queen Liliuokalani. And he did describe it as an improper and unlawful intervention. However, the restoration efforts faltered. And, that provisional government that was put in control, the Committee of Safety, right? They established their own provisional government. They refused to relinquish their control. So by the next year in 1894, the Republic of Hawaii was declared under the leadership of, guess who? Sanford B. Dole, right? The fruit magnate, right? Okay, so the overthrow here reveals this critical dynamic that the private economic elites, how they mobilize American diplomatic and military presence here in order to secure their authority and engender political transformation, whereby, Americans, the American elite becomes in control in the islands, right? So you have annexation take place, the beginnings of it by 1896. Now it's important to note here that Native Hawaiians, let's remember we call them the Kanaka Maoli. It's stated in the previous slide there, Kanaka Maoli. Well, they had organized massive petition campaigns opposing annexation. And here's an illustration of it, right? Their signatures on here. So you see tens of thousands of signed petitions condemning annexation by the U.S., but their voices were largely disregarded. Of course, this is what you could expect, right? Because, as we keep emphasizing here, the geostrategic importance, the location of Hawaii is just deemed too important to ignore. And therefore, it seems as if, well, it actually is the case that Hawaii, the takeover of Hawaii was an inexorable process by this time. Now, during this time, the issue of citizenship arose, and let's recall this is similar to the case of Puerto Rico and the Philippines, as we discussed. Now, let me remind you that in the case of the Philippines, the fact that there is over 10 million Filipinos during the time of annexation automatically meant that citizenship conferred to the Filipino natives was, well, it was inconceivable, right? Because you couldn't imagine a place outside the boundaries of the continental U.S., a territory, a colony, right, whereby citizenship would be granted to brown-skinned people. Let's remember that in the case of Puerto Rico, however, they're deemed white, right, according to racial classification at that time. So they were conferred citizenship. Now, what about Hawaii, though, right? Well, let's remember this. By 1900, Hawaii is indeed a settler colony. Okay, and this is going to influence the decision on U.S. citizenship. Native Hawaiians, the Kanaka Maoli, had declined to roughly 40,000. Okay, so they're definitely a minority in their own homeland. Okay, so what you have here is racial replacement, where one race replaces another in this area, right? This geographical area. And this is what's happening in Hawaii at this time. As I just stated earlier, they're a minority in their own ancestral land, right? You have large numbers of settlers coming in at the time. You had, of course, the European and American elites, the planters, the businessmen. And as I mentioned earlier, you had Asian laborers brought in as a cheap labor force to work in the plantation, Japanese, Chinese, and eventually Portuguese and Filipino contract laborers working in Hawaii. And if you know anything about quote unquote Hawaiian culture today, right, it's a mixture of all of that, right? Filipino influence, Puerto Rican influence, because you're going to see some Puerto Ricans also working in the plantations in Hawaii. Certainly Asian, especially Japanese influence, right, in Hawaii today. Okay, so of course a core feature of settler colonialism is permanent immigrant settlement that displaces the indigenous presence, right, and therefore displaces indigenous political control. Okay, by 1900, this condition actually existed. Okay, so therefore, the residents became U.S. citizens, similar to Puerto Rico. Okay, and again, this arrangement illustrates a recurring pattern in American expansion and the annexation of its quote unincorporated territories. Right, this idea of incorporation without equality. Okay, they're incorporated, but the people, even though they're conferred citizenship, they're not equal, right? As we know today, for example, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, but they can't vote, right? It's what we call differential inclusion again. By the way, Hawaii was not granted statehood until 1959. So for nearly 6 decades, it existed in this intermediate, if you will, or in-betweenness that we called it, right? The intermediate or in-betweenness in its constitutional position. They're neither foreign nor fully equal. And this definitely describes Hawaii and the natives, the Kanaka Maoli. Okay, one thing I should have mentioned a little bit earlier is that the Organic Act was the actual law that formally annexed Hawaii as entering the United States as a territory, okay, as quote unquote unincorporated territory. And as we mentioned, this meant limited self government and this idea of the natives of Hawaii as, intermediate in its relation to the United States, right? So the Organic Act of 1900 formally organizes Hawaii as U.S. territory here. All right, now, one thing we have to acknowledge here is, again, the centrality of militarism in this scenario, okay? Let's remember this guy, Alfred Thayer Mahan, and his ideas that would influence U.S. naval doctrine during this time, right? This doctrine posits the importance, of securing global power based on a powerful navy. And this is a time when the Navy was modernizing, okay? It doesn't surprise us that this happens during the Industrial Revolution that's happening at this very time. It was transforming, in other words, the Navy from the old Navy, so to speak, which is the wooden ships, right? And the sails, you're using the wind for your energy, to those, industrial ships made of steel and using coal as your energy rather than nature, right? So the Navy was transforming at this time to a modern Navy, the New Navy, as they called it. And, U.S. Government officials and leaders realized the crucial importance of having a modern Navy, and therefore it directly influenced U.S. actions in the Pacific. So Pearl Harbor, as we mentioned, was established right after the Reciprocity Treaty, and it became a centerpiece of U.S. Pacific power. Still today, that's the case. But you also had Guam becoming a forward operating base for wars in Asia. And Samoa, okay, Samoa will be split between the Americans and Germany, but our area called American Samoa would serve as a refueling and logistics hub, a coal refueling area. Okay, as I mentioned, the energy depends on coal. And of course, you had the Philippines here, two major bases eventually in the Philippines during the 20th century. Okay, so militarism is a foundational logic here. From the outset, Guam was, once it became annexed as a territory with the end of the Spanish-American War, Guam was governed not by civilian administrators, but by the U.S. Navy, okay, for decades. And Congress did not immediately grant U.S. citizenship to the Chamorros. Okay, Chamorros are native Guamanians. Okay, Chamorro. Chamorro. Okay, they're the indigenous people. And again, the island's value was based on geography. It was positioned between the Philippines and Hawaii. So, as I mentioned, Guam became a refueling station, an operating base, communications hub. And with Samoa, which we also gained with the Treaty of Paris after the Spanish-American War, we see a similar pattern. It was placed under naval administration. There's a harbor in Samoa called Pago Pago, 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 and it was deemed valuable for its depth and its defensive potential. So like Guam, American Samoa was governed through a military chain of command for decades, okay, before they did allow some kind of limited civilian self-government. So here, militarism is not merely defensive, it's structural, right? It's intentional.